Hi, everyone. We're going to let folks trickle in for just a minute here, and then we're going to get started. Thanks so much for joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we're going to get started. We've got a really great session today. We want to maximize our time for everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started today with Unpacking Ableism and Embracing Disability Identity. My name is Hillary Pearson. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman in my late 30s wearing glasses and a turquoise top sitting in my home office in Forest Park, Illinois. And thank you so much for being here today. I am the program manager for accessibility services for ALA's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services. So setting our foundation today, we do have real-time human captioning available. To view the captions, you should have a captions button found at the bottom of your screen where you can turn on the captions. It might be under the three dots in more. But if you have any questions or technical issues, you can use the chat to connect with Aubrey from my team if there's anything that we need to make sure that we course correct for access. We also have interpreters. You should be able to view the interpreters. And yeah, let us know if there's any issues. Image descriptions will be used to describe visual content for today's slides. And this session will be recorded and shared with registrants following, probably in the week or so following. And just a reminder to take care of your comfort. If you need to get up, move around, stretch. This is a 90-minute program with a lot of really awesome content, and we're really happy to have you here. But please take in the information in the way that's best for you and your environment. Just a real quick overview of the Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services. So ODLO supports library and information science workers in creating responsible and all-inclusive spaces that serve and represent the entire community. To accomplish this, we decenter power and privilege by facilitating conversations around access and identity as they impact the profession and those we serve. So a very fitting topic today as we round out Disability Pride Month and celebrate the 35th anniversary of the ADA. We use a social justice framework to inform library and information science workers' development of resources. And we strive to create an association culture where these concerns are incorporated into everybody's everyday work. It is my pleasure to introduce today our main presenter, Bree Beck, to lead us in this learning around ableism and disability identity. Bree will share more info about herself, but a few quick highlights for Bree. Bree is the owner and therapist of Bree Beck Counseling and Consulting, LLC. She is the Arts and Culture Coordinator for Access Living and an active member of Chicago's disability arts, culture, and advocacy communities. We're so excited, and I will pass the baton to her real shortly to continue talking about her work and sharing with you her knowledge. And also we will have really three fantastic ALA member leaders in a facilitated conversation following Bree's main presentation. We will have Brittany Ballard, Learning Technologies Librarian at Towson University's Albert S. Cook Library, Katie Quirin-Manwiller, Education Librarian and Assistant Professor at the University Libraries of Westchester University, and Brad McKenna, Technology Librarian at the Wilmington Memorial Library in Massachusetts. A full bio for all presenters will be linked in the chat along with some other resources. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to Bree to continue this great conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Hillary, for that lovely introduction. I am going to share some slides myself here. This presentation today is Unpacking Ableism and Embracing Disability Identity. Again, my name is Bree. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor and registered art therapist. And Hillary already gave a little bit of a bio about me, but yeah, I'm living in Chicago, Illinois. I am a disability affirming care trainer and consultant, meaning that I love to work with fellow therapists and other healthcare individuals, especially learn about anti-ableist and more disability affirming care practices, especially when they interface with working with the disability community. I'm a disability studies adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in their art therapy program. I'm a mixed media artist myself. I have a therapy practice, and I'm a person with lived experience of disability. I live with a skeletal dysplasia, it's a long word, called pseudoachondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism. So I am a person of short stature, but along with being a person of short stature, I have a lot of chronic pain and limited mobility, so I do use a mobility aid full time. And a lot of my lived experience is really integrated into my work and my art practice and how I teach and share with others and how I work with my clients. So I am so grateful to be here today. A brief image description of me, both in this video frame and on screen, is I am a white woman. I'm in my mid-30s. I'm wearing tortoiseshell glasses in my video, but wire-rimmed glasses in the photo. I have long brown hair that is wavy, and I am currently sitting in my office in Chicago. So just so you know what to expect today, my portion of this presentation will be about 60 minutes. So we'll go until about 2 o'clock Central Time or till the end of the hour, wherever you are. And then the last portion of this event will be a 30-minute panel with the lovely panelists that were just introduced. So what I'm going to cover today is really just a big overview about all things disability. It's a massive topic, so I'm going to do my best to hit on some really important factors that I think will be important for particularly your work in library work and maybe for even learning about yourself and your own understanding of disability and disability identity or disability in your relationships. So I hope that you will take away some important information today. But I'm going to talk a lot about models of disability or different paradigms of disability, how we think about disability. I'm going to talk about the various layers of ableism and how those can show up in our day-to-day lives. I'm going to go into a little bit about disability history and disability rights. I'm going to talk about disability identity and culture. And then at the end, I'm just going to offer some personal reflection questions for us all to really think about how this ties into all of our lives. So first and foremost, though, who is the disability community? As we know, this is Disability Pride Month. I do see someone raise their hand. I'm gonna see if Hillary or another facilitator can handle that if needed. So I'm going to briefly talk about the Disability Pride flag because it does a really good job of really offering the full scope of the disability community. So the Disability Pride flag here is this kind of grayish black background with 5 stripes going diagonally. The black field represents the disabled people who have lost their lives because unfortunately there is sometimes a lot of grief in disability community and folks not having access to care that they need or disabilities claiming lives too soon. But there's also different categories of disability, such as physical disabilities in this red stripe here, yellow representing cognitive and intellectual disabilities. Invisible and undiagnosed disabilities is this white color. Mental illness is represented by blue, and sensory or perception disabilities is represented by green. And in no way is this list necessarily exhaustive, but these are the 5 categories that the flag represents. Along with that, disability can be apparent or non-apparent, meaning others can tell if one is disabled, and sometimes others cannot tell if one has a disability. Disability can be congenital, so acquired from birth or genetic. It can be acquired later in life. It can be temporary. It can be progressive. It can be on again and off again. Ebbing and flowing is another way to put that. So this time element of disability is also something to consider when it comes to the diversity of the community. And another note here is that people often have co-occurring disabilities or impairments. As a therapist, I see a lot of folks that have physical disabilities, but along with that, they may also live with major depression or chronic pain and anxiety. So disability can be multifaceted. It can change over time. It's not necessarily a stagnant category or experience. So some other notes that may help us kind of understand who this community is exactly. An estimated 1.3 billion people experience significant disability, and this represents about 16% of the world's population, or about 1 in 6. So it is a very significant portion of the world. Approximately 70% of all disabilities are invisible or non-apparent. So the majority of disabled people we often don't even recognize are right in front of us. And according to Harvard Business Review, 88% of employees with invisible disabilities choose not to disclose it at work to avoid stigma and discrimination. So due to stigma and ableism, a lot of folks are not even claiming disability or coming out, you may say, as disabled. And if we consider the effects of aging as a disabling experience, we're fortunate enough to live long enough, all of us will experience disability at some point in our lives. So disability impacts us all, pretty much guaranteed at some point in our lives, especially if we are lucky enough to live to age into our elderly years. So I'm going to read a quote here from disability studies scholar L.J. Davis, when it really asks us to think, what exactly is it that creates disability? And the quote says, "We live in a world of norms. To understand the disabled body, one must return to the concept of the norm, or the normal body. So much of writing about disability has focused on the disabled person as the object of study, just as the study of race has focused on the person of color. But as with recent scholarship on race, which has turned its attention to whiteness and intersectionality, I would like to focus not on the construction of disability as on the construction of normalcy. I do this because the problem, quote unquote, is not the person with disabilities. The problem is in the way that normalcy is constructed to create the problem of the disabled person." So I love this quote because it does a great job of really doing a 180 and asking us to think, well, if disability is a thing, what is disability being compared against? And really, disability is, in a lot of ways, what exists in contrast to normalcy. But what is normal exactly? So I think this does a great job of bringing up some interesting ways of rethinking what we all think we know about disability. So next, I'm going to shift a little bit into paradigms of disability or models of disability. And this just is different ways of conceiving it. So the primary model of disability in our culture, particularly in the Western world, is the medical model of disability. And the medical model of disability places the problem of disability on the disabled individual, which almost always leads the disabled individual to the medical industrial complex or other institutional settings for corrective treatment. And the main idea here really is that there is something wrong with a person, with an individual that needs to be cured, remediated, or accommodated. And there are some pros to the medical model, even though in a lot of ways, which I'll get into, it's very oppressive. Medical treatment for disability can greatly increase quality or even quantity of life. And most people with disabilities actively seek this support for their well-being. But the cons of the medical model of disability is that disability becomes a problem that is inherently negative and stigmatized. Power is also given to the medical industrial complex to be the experts on disabled people's experiences. And often disabled people lose their own voice and their own agency in their own care because they become the object of study and critique and something to be fixed versus a collaborator in their own care. So this is the dominant model that we're dealing with, right? And you can see why only looking at disability in this way can be problematic. But on the other hand, we can actually look at disability from a completely different perspective by flipping the script and talking about the social model of disability. And I have a piece of artwork here that I am on the screen that I am sitting in that I will describe here shortly. But with this model, disability is redefined as being created by human-made systems, such as lack of ramps into public spaces, a lack of diverse employment opportunities, or academic gatekeeping. It really says, look at the systems and how they're built, and who are they built for, and who do they actually exclude. So the main idea here is that the way the world is designed is only for certain types of bodies and minds to be successful. It sees disability as a social construction. And in this model of disability, the social model, which is a part of disability studies and an academic way of seeing disability within the field of disability studies, this is one of the dominant paradigms. Disability is actually kind of redefined here. So I'll go ahead and read the social model's definition of disability. And in this model, disability is seen as the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by contemporary social organization, which takes no or little account of people who have body-mind impairments and thus excludes them from mainstream social activities. So in this model, if one is disabled, it means that they are disabled by their environment. And in the model, they define impairment in its own term. So in this model, impairment is defined as an injury, an illness, a congenital condition that causes or is likely to cause a loss or difference of physiological or psychological functioning. So if we look at myself, right, as an example here, me being a person of short stature who uses a mobility aid, my impairment under this model is the pain that I experience in my joints, the fact that my body does not allow me to walk long distances. And that is really what's essentially going on within my body itself. But my disability is the fact that it's really hard for me to go up a set of stairs because those stairs are designed a certain way for certain kinds of bodies. I am disabled by the fact that a lot of entrances into buildings have a step up to them. And because I have a scooter, I can't go inside. Or I'm disabled by the fact that most environments are built for average stature people, and I am of short stature. So one is looking at the environment and one is looking at just me. And this photo here is actually an art project that I created when I was in graduate school. So for me, being a person of short stature, furniture and environments, again, have always been pretty inaccessible or even uncomfortable because the proportions of my body are not meant for, say, an average chair. So I had first learned about the social model of disability when I was in graduate school. And for me, as somebody who had only seen myself through the medical model my entire life, having been through so many surgeries and doctor's appointments, this idea that disability could be a social construction was revolutionary for me. And I remember that I wanted to build my own chair to see how it felt to sit in a piece of furniture that was actually meant for me. And so I took PVC pipe, which was a cheap material, and I sketched it all out and I had it cut at a hardware store and I put it all together, sort of like Tinker Toys. And I used actually ace bandages and some string to create the body of the chair. So I had a back and a seat. And though I will say this was a prototype, it was not the most comfortable chair with the materials. Just the act of sitting in this chair and having my back be supported and having my feet touch the ground and having the arm height at the right height for my shorter limbs was just really powerful. And seeing this photo for the first time after having my friend take my photo was also really powerful to see what does it look like when the furniture is made for me. And I remember thinking, like, I don't look as out of place as I typically do. And I've always just found that this illustrates the social model really well. But as with all things in life, not everything is black and white. Most things are actually in the gray. So I think this quote sums it up really well. This is a great book, Disability Theory by Tobin Siebers. It's pretty high, jargon disability studies theory, but it does offer some great insight. And one of the quotes here says, some scholars complain that the medical model pays too much attention to embodiment, while the social model leaves it out of the discussion. Without returning to a medical model which labels individuals as defective, the next step is for those engaged in disability advocacy is to develop a theory of complex embodiment that values disability as a form of human variation. So that's a pretty fancy way of saying, you know what, disability is all those things. It is sometimes about what's going on in an individual's body, especially when it comes to, how maybe they experience pain or discomfort, or maybe their disability is something that is a rare disease or is actually something that is life-threatening, that needs attention and care. But if we only focus on that and we leave out the social responsibility of the way that the world is built, it's just such a flattened way to look at disability. And again, very oppressive and leads to ableism. But what if we see disability as diversity, right? And that almost feels overly simplistic when I say it, but really that's what it is. The diversity model of disability sees disability as a natural part of human variation, much like differences in race, gender, or ethnicity. Instead of framing disability only as a medical problem or personal limitation, this perspective recognizes it as one of many human differences. It underscores the need to design inclusive environments and systems that support and reflect this diversity. So really, this is saying that disability has always been a part of human existence and also all of life, right? Like I have this photo here because I love to think about differences or disability even in all forms of biology. These flowers have genetic mutations technically that create the petals in different colors, with this pink flower having white petals and this white flower having a pink petal, right? There are genetic differences in all of us and none of us are the same. And some of us are impacted by disability more than others, but disability is not something to be feared. It's something to be expected and anticipated versus something to be eradicated. But unfortunately, most of culture, right, sees disability as a negative thing and as something to be feared or avoided. And that leads to ableism. And I'm going to briefly just define ableism. I'm sure many of you have heard this term and understand it, but I'm just going to offer a definition just to get us on the same page here. So ableism is at its heart the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. And at its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines them by their disability. And like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than, and it includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations about people with disabilities. Oops, excuse me. So ableism can look a lot of ways, but I'm just going to offer 3 different kind of levels or layers of disability, or excuse me, of ableism. So ableism can be institutional. It can be in the way that our systems are built. Ableism can be interpersonal in how we treat or stigmatize each other or leave people out. And ableism can certainly be internalized. And as a therapist who is disabled and who works with a lot of disabled people, it is something that many disabled people carry. So I will get into each of those layers just a bit here. But first, it's also important to note, like, how are we here, particularly right now in the modern world? Because not that disability or impairments weren't always something that humanity and communities dealt with, but in pre-industrial societies, there were different systems of care where disabled individuals played more visible roles within family and local contexts. When things were smaller and more localized, there were more opportunities for disabled people to participate. But due to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, particularly in the rest of the Western world, as societies industrialized, productivity and labor norms marginalized those not conforming to ideal workers. Disabled people were often excluded from meaningful employment and considered economically unproductive. This would be known as the economic model of disability, where disability is really defined by whether or not you can work. And there's also the rise of institutionalization and eugenics. And there's so much we could get into with that, but I'm just going to offer a brief bullet point here, where in the late 19th to earliest 20th century, there was widespread institutional care that was rooted in notions of fixing or segregating disability. Eugenics gained traction in the US, advocating for forced sterilization and family purity measures that disproportionately targeted disabled people. So it really is in this industrialization that disability was seen as such a negative aspect of the human race that needed to be eradicated, and that even with the invention of modern medicine, that humans could essentially play God and make that happen, even though disability will always be a part of life. But thank goodness, disabled people are extremely resilient, and there has been an incredible disability rights movement here in the US and globally. I'm just going to highlight a few important milestones that disabled people have reached, especially in the last less than 100 years. Really, in the United States, awareness around disability really grew after the First World War and the Second World War, where wartime veterans with disabilities were coming back from war. And there was also many that were inflicted with polio. And the rise of especially disabled people visibly using wheelchairs and being more in the public eye really drew public attention to access and rehabilitation needs, laying the groundwork for more organized activism. I'm also going to highlight the Section 504 and 504 sit-ins in the mid-1970s, where Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act promoted or prohibited discrimination in federally funded programs. And after years of delay, most notably in San Francisco, activists were able to push the government and implement the regulation, which represented the largest nonviolent occupation of federal building in US history. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed, which guaranteed the right to public education for children with disabilities. And of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, was passed in 1990, which is landmark civil rights legislation prohibiting discrimination, especially in employment, public accommodations, transportation, and more. And this was preceded by activism like the Capitol Crawl. If you all haven't seen Crip Camp, the documentary, I highly recommend watching it. Some of the activists up here in the black and white photo, notably Judy Heumann, who is the woman to the far right in the photo with the microphone, is a very famous disability rights activist who was featured in Crip Camp and did a lot of organizing to get Section 504 passed. So many amazing acts of resiliency and organizing with disabled within the disability community have occurred. One thing I'll even note about the ADA, which as Hillary mentioned, we just celebrated 35 years of the ADA, is that even though the ADA is landmark legislation, there's still so much work that needs to be done. And I heard an activist say the other day at the Disability Pride Parade that the ADA is not the ceiling, it is the floor. And it is basic, human rights for disabled people. But so much of the ADA has not been implemented yet. And it often takes a lawsuit to even have the ADA be considered when it comes to granting access to, say, a building, or if somebody is unable to access a workplace, school, etc. So there's still so much that needs to be done for the full integration and inclusion of disabled people. And just a little bit more about institutional ableism today. Even though institutionalization was so much more prominent in the 20th century, and community-based living has instead replaced a lot of institutionalization today, there is still institutionalization on a grand scale. So this essentially means that when disabled people are forced to live in nursing homes due to lack of accessible housing or additional support from family or community members. And I'll note here that recent federal legislation under the Trump administration is aiming to strip many disabled people of their Medicaid, likely forcing more disabled people into institutional settings versus being able to live in their home independently with personal care aides. Something else that a lot of folks don't know is that many disabled people do not have marriage equality due to outdated laws that essentially say that if you receive benefits like Medicaid or supplemental Social Security income, that when you marry someone and their partner's income is factored in, it can count against them. and limit their access to these support services. So many disabled people are not able to marry for fear of losing their benefits. And so many people experience still education challenges. And I'm going to read here a quote from the book Academic Ableism, which says the ethic of higher education encourages students and teachers alike to accentuate ability, valorize perfection, and stigmatize anything that hints at intellectual, mental, or physical weakness, even as we gesture toward the value of diversity and innovation. Just a brief note here on ableism in media. You all work in the media sphere as being in library work. There are so many tropes or binaries that come to how disabled people are represented. So many times in either books, movies, television, disabled people can be deemed kind of one or the other. They can either be very heroic and inspirational, or they can be the villain, right? They can be disfigured in some way or seen as scary. They can be inspirational, or they can be a tragic figure. They can sometimes be even asexual or childlike, even when they're adults. Or on the other end of the spectrum, they can even be fetishized and over-sexualized. So oftentimes it's very rare for a disabled person to just be a person or a character in a movie or a book. And I put this photo here, which is an example of what those in the community call inspiration porn, which is the usage in memes or commercials or any sort of online or television media that essentially uses images or examples of disabled people being inspiring to encourage non-disabled people to not feel so bad about themselves, or to to just, if they can do it, so can you, sort of thing. So the quote here says, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." So things like that, which I think many of us have seen. I am just going to make sure here that I can share my sound. 1 minute. Share computer sound. Here we go. I think that should work. I have a clip here that is a trailer
A
from
movie
a
that I
film
like.
called Code of the Freaks, which was actually produced here in Chicago. And the film is all about representation of disability in media. So I'm going to quickly play that trailer.
No, I can't name it.
Yeah, it's a pretty short list.
I think that the image, the screen image, is the sole definer for the general population of disability.
There are a lot of stereotypes of disability in the movies, and in fact, there's nothing but.
How people are represented, of course, is not the decision of the community. It's the writer, the filmmaker, the actors even.
What life? I got no life! I'm in the dark here!
Killing disabled people is a happy ending. Curing disability is meant to be a happy ending. Institutionalizing is meant to be a happy ending.
People are always wanting to show little people as magical.
It seems as if that's the first thing blind people want, is to feel your face. I don't know, I've just never had that happen to me.
The evildoer, of course, is disfigured. I think somewhere in the dark reptilian part of our brains, we think, well, evildoers must be ugly.
Our job as disabled people is to become in a position of enough power to be able to input into that imagery.
Most people feel that to be able to think about a movie as you're seeing it is destroying your ability to enjoy the movie. And I would argue that it enhances your ability to enjoy the movie.
If anyone would like access to that film, I think my email will be shared at the end of this presentation through Hillary, so feel free to email me and I can do my best to connect you with the independent filmmakers who produced that film, which is an amazing critique on disability representation in media. I'm next just going to briefly cover interpersonal ableism. This is really the ableism that I think most of us are familiar with, where it really just occurs in how we treat one another directly, particularly in our communities or in our workplace, etc. So essentially, it's people who discriminate against people with disabilities, and they can certainly do so with ill intentions, but interpersonal ableism is often a lot more subtle and nuanced. And some examples of what that could look like is, in a family system, right? A caretaker or a family member who thinks they're being helpful by making medical decisions for someone is wrongly assuming that all disabled people can't make their own decisions. It's about using ableist language to describe unwanted or quote unquote weird scenarios, using phrases like "that's crazy," which is something that I know I'm trying my best to eliminate from my vocabulary. The R word, retarded, lame, etc., are really all disability-centric words that are used to describe something that is not welcome, right? Or not right. It can look like downplaying someone's disability just because it isn't visible. So not believing someone when they say, I have a non-apparent disability, I'm unable to do something, I don't have the energy for something, or I'm having a pain flare-up. I work with a lot of folks who are neurodivergent who say that it's very difficult to describe their experience to others because their disability is invisible and why it may be difficult to do certain things, and that they're just supposed to quote unquote get over it, sort of thing. It can look like patronizing a disabled person or treating them as younger than they are. And the next piece here is about internalized ableism. So this is a disabled person's learned acceptance of the societal stereotypes about themselves. And it often results in feelings of negativity and even poor mental health. And it can occur in many forms, such as feeling ashamed of your disability or wishing that you could live without it, feeling disappointed with yourself for not being able to pursue the same opportunities or have the same level of productivity as other people, feeling overwhelmed by societal expectations, rejecting community with other disabled people in order to distance yourself from that stigma, and also rejecting accommodations or support as to not appear weak. And I love this image here, which says, I will overcome my disability, crossed out in red. And then underneath it says internalized ableism, because I know this is something that for myself as a disabled person, for a therapist that works within this community, this is something that is talked about so much, where our whole, as disabled people, we're just supposed to overcome so much and surpass so many barriers. And if we can do that, then we've beaten disability and we've somehow succeeded. But really, it is internalized ableism that so many of us have to come to terms with and reckon with. And I think that's for all of us, even if we don't identify as disabled, because all of us experience internalized ableism when we're struggling to do something, or we don't feel productive enough, we don't feel even worthy enough. There are always that, we don't feel like our bodies fit in, or that we're too fat or skinny, right? These are all ableist concepts. So it really does impact all of us. So I'm just going to briefly talk about disability identity. You may have heard me kind of switching back and forth between the phrase disabled people and people with disabilities. I'll just say here that I use those interchangeably. Some folks may be surprised to hear myself or someone else in the community say I'm a disabled person. But for me, as somebody especially who has really critiqued disability and my own internalized ableism and really gotten clear on some of the macro reasons why disability is seen as so inherently negative. For me, it has been so important to really reclaim that word and proudly identify as disabled, because it is true. I am disabled in many ways, but for me, it is a human experience. It is a neutral term, just as I identify as a woman, or I am a white person, right? These are all just neutral facets of who I am. And for me to say I'm disabled is not me saying I'm less than, I'm incapable. So for me, that's what I identify as. But for some people, they may prefer to say I am a person with disability. I am a person with dwarfism, with, XYZ, put in whatever impairment or disability you would like. But it is probably safest to refer to the group as people with disabilities, just because not everybody identifies as disabled, and that's okay, but some people do, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So first, identity, right? What is identity? And it is the qualities, beliefs, etc., that make a particular person or group different from others. And what is disability identity? Which this means a sense of self that includes one's disability and feelings of connection to or solidarity with the disability community. So a coherent disability identity is believed to help individuals adapt to disability, including navigating related social stressors and daily hassles. So really, disability identity is essentially what I was just saying, right? It's a way that one can identify in either a neutral or positive way that says, I am disabled because I fit into this category of lived experience that others with disabilities of all kinds also face. And identifying as disabled can really invite one into a community, which can be such an important support in their lives. Which leads me to talk about disability culture. So let's also define culture. Culture is this idea that your life is influenced by not only your beliefs and the way you think, but the way others around you think. Culture can take form in art or traditions, expectations, interpersonal interactions, as well as aligned political goals. So just a brief blurb here about disability culture, because disabled people have created their own culture based on shared experiences, right? That have come to create something brand new. So this quote here from Steve Brown, who is the founder of the Institute on Disability Culture, says that people with disabilities have forged a group identity. We share a common history of oppression and a common bond of resilience. We generate art, music, literature, and other expressions of our lives and our culture infused from our experience of disability. And most importantly, we are proud of ourselves. We claim our disabilities with pride as part of our identity. And so within any community or culture, right, there are certain nuances that can occur, or certain phrases or concepts, terminology that can emerge based on how the group kind of interacts with each other. A phrase that I'm just going to use as an example of this from disability culture and community is this concept of crip time. And so I'll read this here from Ellen Samuels. So this is a phrase I should say before I read this that disabled people use with one another to talk about, let's say they're running late for something, or, they're trying to meet up and something gets in the way of making that happen. They might say, oh, I'm running on crip time today. So crip time is time travel. Disability and illness have the power to extract us from linear, progressive time with its normative life stages and cast us into a wormhole of backward and forward acceleration, jerky stops and starts, tedious intervals, and abrupt endings. Some of us contend with the impairments of old age while still young. Some of us are treated like children no matter how old we get. The medical language of illness tries to reimpose the linear, speaking in terms of the chronic, the progressive, and the terminal, and relapses in stages. So it essentially is bringing language to the fact that disabled people may experience time differently. They may take a long time just on like a kind of a basic level with this, right? They may take longer to get ready in the morning or to get dressed because maybe their pain is acting up that day, or maybe their personal care attendant is running late and they can't make it to work on time. But it also talks about more abstract ideas, right? Whereas me as somebody who has a lot of arthritis and difficulty walking might experience life in my 30s similar to somebody who's in their 80s who has to use a wheelchair or a walker to get around, right? So it's this idea that, humanity and the timeline of life is not always linear, especially when disability is involved, and how we may experience age or certain milestones in our lives, right? So I think it's really lovely that the community has kind of dubbed this term crip time. And that's just an example of how shared experience can create new language. But disability culture is certainly not a monolith, right? There are subcultures within disability. There's mad culture or mad pride, which is for folks with psychiatric disabilities, and they have their own kind of, art world and culture and ways of speaking that's all around non-pathologizing mental illness. There's deaf culture, which I say here, including CODA, which stands for Children of Deaf Adults, which is all about, deaf community has its own art world and its own history, and using ASL as its own beautiful language. And there are certain, you know, words and language that are not the same in the typical English language, right? And so it's something brand new. There's also disability arts, and all of the photos here that I have are actually artists that are here in Chicago where I live. There are disability artists all over the world, but Chicago happens to be kind of a really awesome epicenter of disability art. Here in this first photo is a photo of Momenta Dance Company, which is an integrated dance company with both able-bodied and wheelchair-using dancers. And so the wheelchairs are an integrated part of that performance. Here is a photo of artist Andy Slater, who is visually impaired, and he is a sound artist, and he creates these incredible soundscapes and sometimes even collaborates with visual artists and adds sound to their work in a really neat, collaborative, interdisciplinary way. And the third photo here is a photo of artist Chunshan Sandy Yi, and she has an impairment where she has on her hands 2 fingers on each hand instead of 5, and so she has created a series of fashion called Crip Couture, where she uses fashion and embroidery to actually highlight her impairment instead of hiding them, and essentially using her hands as inspiration for new garment design. These 2 photos here are actually photos of artwork that I did that would be considered disability art. So this first photo here is in an art gallery. There are 3 walls in the installation. On the first wall here on the left, it says the words "you are so," and those words are actually written with my body, with my hand, and different, this part of the Y here is actually a print where I painted my leg black and pushed it against the wall. So I used my body as the motif for the text. And then on this wall here, it says positive. And then it's hard to tell here, but there's a video installation on the wall as well that will eventually flash the words and the word articulate. And the viewers are invited to kneel down and look at the art from my eye level at more of a mid-wall height level. And the cushions are covered in gold stars. And this piece was about how I always felt my whole life that I was really put into that inspiration porn category. I was told that by many non-disabled people often that I was so inspirational and so positive, and that, you know, I just felt like I had to be this representation of hope to everybody, even though I was just living my life. And I think a lot of disabled people are put in that position unwillingly, and feel like it's not their job to represent an entire community or a whole concept, right? So this installation was really a critique of that idea. The second photo here is a piece that I created actually out of the objects that I use to get around, such as a step stool here. And I also used objects that I use to manage my chronic pain, such as a lumbar support pillow, a foam roller, those little Theracanes that you use to work out those muscle knots, and a few other objects there. And the idea is, to create art out of things that may have an inherently difficult or negative meaning for me, or something that I have to work with a lot to manage my disability. But for me, especially being an art therapist, I find it so powerful to turn things that maybe have a negative connotation or even a medical connotation into art. And so it was super fun for me to just paint all those things bright hot pink and slap them together and make something that looked a little bit like a, you know, contemporary piece of art in an art gallery. I am getting close to the end of the presentation here, but I want to briefly talk about disability justice. The words or the term disability justice can often be used synonymously with the word disability rights. And it makes sense because they sound very similar. But disability justice is actually a framework or another paradigm of disability that's important for us to all know and to understand, because it really does dive a little bit deeper into issues of disability when it comes to, you know, different intersections of identity and how those can influence the disability experience. So disability justice is a term created by disabled, queer, and trans people of color, including most notably Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, and other members of Sins Invalid, which is actually a disability performance art group. I believe they were located in the Bay Area, and this was originated in the mid-2000s. And essentially what this group of people were saying is that a lot of the representation around disability is very whitewashed. I can even say for myself here, and you know, like I'm a white person, and I'm the person that's speaking about disability to you all today, and I want to be mindful of how I am not the voice of the community, and I certainly have other identities that have me experience more privilege than other disabled people. So it's really this idea of like, hey, when we look at disability, we have to look at intersectionality. We have to look at Black disabled people, Indigenous, queer, trans, and otherwise marginalized disabled people, and how their other marginalized identities also influence their lived experiences of oppression and even their disability experience. So it also recognizes that ableism is intertwined with racism, capitalism, and other forms of oppression. And it really calls for a shift from just individual access to this really, you know, larger collective liberation for so many groups of people. So we're going to move into a little bit of reflection now. So I'm just going to offer a few reflection questions for you all to consider before we move into our panel portion. So for yourselves as people, and then I'm going to offer a slide about how you can think about this in your work as professionals, but as a person, how has disability, whether it being apparent or non-apparent, personal to you or relational, right? In your maybe role of caregiving or supporting someone with disability. Yeah, how has that shown up in your own life? And what assumptions have you carried about disability? And where did those assumptions come from? In what ways have I been taught, explicitly or subtly, that productivity, independence, or physical and mental ability determine a person's worth? And have I ever felt shame, guilt, or frustration around my own limitations or needs? And where do those feelings come from? And some questions to maybe take into your professional role. How do disabled patrons and staff experience a sense of belonging in this library and not just access or accessibility? How do our displays, collections, and programs reflect the voices, histories, and cultures of disabled people? In what ways do we value multiple ways of communicating, learning, and engaging in our library spaces? And what is one belief, practice, or policy that you're willing to examine or change after today? Okay, well, I'm just doing a quick time check, and I think we are a little bit ahead of schedule, which is actually, I think, a pretty good thing because we have some great panelists today, and I have a lot of questions for them if we have time. And it's so important for us to really hear from experts and those in the field who are living this out day to day. So I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I am going to invite our panelists here. So thank you all for your time and listening to me gab for about an hour now. We have with us today Brittany and Katie, and we have Brad. So I am going to go ahead and just start us off with a question. So the first question I have for you all is, can you briefly share your journey into librarianship and how your disability identity perspective has shaped that path?
Sure, and I just want to say thank you so much, Bree, for that wonderful presentation. I continue to learn, even as someone disabled myself who engages with fellow disabled colleagues and materials. There's always more to learn and unlearn, so thank you. This is Brittany speaking. I'm a white woman in my mid-30s with shoulder length, wavy brown hair, blue-green bangs, and rose-tinted glasses. I am joining you today from my personal office in Baltimore City, Maryland. The question again is sharing the journey into librarianship and how my disability identity perspective has shaped that path. So I was in my first year of graduate school pursuing a master's degree in English literature when I discovered librarianship as a possible career. My background before then was public, middle, and high school English teaching, followed by for-profit tutoring, a short stint at a video game studio, and then office administration for a religious nonprofit. I left my graduate degree in the College of Liberal Arts because it was proving the stereotypical R1 experience with faculty and peers both presenting as highly competitive solo researchers who did not really value or enjoy teaching. And when I went on to work with my English graduate student peers at the end of my first year in library school as the librarian assigned to support their English 102 students, they would often remark something along the lines of, "Wow, that was so smart to switch. I wonder if I should do the same so that I can get a library job and then be paid to finish my graduate degree and eventually become a professor." So just a hint at sort of the intellectualism that we all know library workers experience, right? These experiences didn't necessarily have anything to do with my disability identity because I did not yet identify as disabled. But they nonetheless did impact my overall well-being and my discovery and path into the profession. The English program was entirely on site, whereas the MLIS program was hybrid. So on-campus courses required me to make a 1-hour commute with a bus transfer, whereas online courses did not have that requirement. And that became super important when I had my first surgery, an emergency surgery, the summer after my first year in library school. I was taking 2 summer courses and had to take a temporary incomplete in one of them, which I later had to complete in addition to regular coursework next semester. I like to say that that surgery and the subsequent incomplete were my official welcome into chronic illness and dynamic disability. So when I considered what kind of roles I would pursue post-graduation, I knew that telework, similar to distance learning, would be essential. And in fact, I did go on to specialize in distance learning librarianship, and that approach did prove successful when, during summer 2021, I requested telework as my first official accommodation, and my job description duty serving distance teachers and learners was a point in favor of getting that request granted.
Thank you so much for that, Brittany. It's like, I appreciate hearing like just how sometimes the practicalities are what shape journeys, right? We'll move on next to Katie.
Hi folks, my name is Katie Corinne Manwiller. I'm also a white woman in her 30s coming to you from her home office in Pennsylvania, and I use she, her pronouns. So I went to get my MLIS right from undergrad. I focused in archives and then eventually shift into an academic library position, an academic librarian position, so I could do more instruction. A lot of my academic library work has been information literacy instruction based, but disability played a large role in my work, especially now, because as I was making the transition into an academic librarian role from archives, I was also coming to terms with being disabled. My chronic illnesses had significantly worsened. And while one of the ways that I came to terms with that was I was able to kind of build a really strong community with other disabled librarians on what used to be library Twitter, and through scholarship, working with other disabled librarians to study the experience of academic librarians with non-apparent disabilities. So much of my work now focuses on disability inclusion in libraries, my scholarship and my service. As a faculty member, those are both central to my roles, and kind of the work I do on a regular basis.
Thank you, Katie. Brad, let's hear about your experience.
So my name is Brad McKenna. I'm a white man. I am in my mid-40s, and I have more gray than brown hair now in both my beard and my short hair. So I failed my first hearing test at 5, but I didn't get my first set of hearing aids until I was 23. So for a long time, I ignored the disability. I needed a job to help me get through my undergrad degree, which was an English major. So you can see I kind of moved up a little bit in the financial prospects, English major, librarian. But anyway, so I needed a job, and so I started working for an IT company, in a healthcare company in the IT department in Boston. And the first few years I was in a data center. So there was plenty of loud servers and printers and everything, constantly making it challenging for everybody to hear. And so when I got a promotion to a more quiet environment, I found that my hearing loss had worsened. It was only a matter of time. My hearing loss is hereditary. And so I finally got my first set of hearing aids at 23. And so when I decided to change careers and become a librarian, I found my technology background really did help me a lot in that. And so my job title is a technology librarian. So I'm in charge of all of everything with a plug, I like to say. So the hardware, the software, the website, all that kind of stuff. But I still didn't really acknowledge my hearing loss, even with my hearing aids, because there's such a stigma to not hearing. You're automatically either not paying attention or you're dumb, essentially, because it's kind of the etymology of that word. So I didn't speak up about my hearing needs until COVID, because I always have so much trouble with the phone. And I remember moving from IT to libraries. One of my questions, when they ask you questions, always see if you always have a question to ask the interviewers. And one of mine was always like, how much phone work is required? Because I can't do it very well, because I wasn't asking for accommodations at the time. But once COVID hit and the masks and all the work on the phone, I had to start asking for accommodations. And so I have a T-Coil headset now. So it actually streams right to my hearing aids, and I can use both ears, however well they work, to have phone calls. And so it wasn't something I really focused on in my job, and I kind of thought I could bluff my way through it, and I wasn't fooling everybody. But now I'm one of the few people who want you to speak up in the library, and I want others to be able to speak up for their needs, no matter what they are. And that's really where I became more involved in ALA and finding other people with hearing loss in the library field. And so I I love these conversations, because it's all about destigmatizing. No matter what the disability is, you got to talk about it. And so thank you everybody for coming to me.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you all for that answer. Like, there's a kind of a common theme that I can relate to as well, whereas like there's kind of a ignoring or denial of the disability, or not necessarily having it impact you as much. And then there's sort of this pushing through as much as you can until eventually you hit a wall, and it's like, then it has to come out. And then there's this process of coming into identity and disclosure and working through your own internalized ableism, right? And kind of but then eventually, and maybe that involves some grieving, or some more emotional work, but there's this embrace and this turning to advocacy and using your role for positive change for others, because it impacts so many of us in different ways. So thank you all for your personal kind of journey to this. And I'm going to ask another question now. So, and this is related, but yeah, how does interpersonal and or internalized ableism, or assumptions about what a librarian, quote unquote, should be, affect opportunities or perceptions in the field? And we're actually going to start with Brad on this one.
I feel like I just talked. No. So for me, it's what I mentioned earlier is I need people to speak up when I'm at the reference desk. And I've been met with anger at that, whether I'm not paying attention to them or having to say what too many times. They get mad, and sometimes I have to have someone else answer the question because I'm at a point where I can't have a conversation with the patron. And I need to stop doing this, but I always apologize when I need people to speak up or repeat what they just said. And that's definitely internalized, right? It's like something I'm doing wrong. And it's a mind shift that I'll have to figure out how to not do that because there's two people involved in these conversations, right? And so it's always that. It's always the conversations that don't go well because I can't understand what the other person is saying. With hearing loss, new voices are challenging. And so there's so many different things that I need to acclimate myself to, whether it's an accent or how loud someone's speaking or how soft someone's speaking or how quickly someone is speaking. And so it takes me a good minute or two to kind of figure out how to hear the person in front of me. And while I'm doing that, I'm getting more and more nervous, which makes it harder to hear and apologizing. And so it really is the internalized ableism, right? I should be able to hear better. And that's challenging. And it's an ongoing battle for me to realize that it's not my fault.
Thank you. And either Katie or Brittany, either of you would like to answer the question.
I can jump in. I think some of it is just that librarianship is no different than the rest of American culture at large, with how strongly ableism is kind of baked in to our society because of things like capitalism and white supremacy. It's just how people were raised if you live in America. And I think specifically in libraries, because of the strong prevalence of vocational awe, that libraries have this commitment to access for everyone, that of course there's like this assumption that of course libraries would be welcoming for disabled library workers, and that's just not true. And there's also a lot with the kind of culture of working on shoestring budgets and dealing with buildings that aren't ADA compliant, like mine, and like having to be really committed because your job is like matters a lot, that we have to do more with less. We have to be really productive with what we have. And all of that kind of culture that of work in libraries is really like antithetical to being disabled. And so it can be really hard, I think, for people to ask for accommodations, to even understand they need help, to not see it as a personal failing, because it's also not like we talk openly and often about what accommodations are in the workplace under the ADA. So I think libraries aren't any really different than the rest of American culture, even though I think a lot of people who work in libraries who are non-disabled kind of assume that it is a more inclusive profession.
Thank you. It's super well put.
So I'll start with this is Brittany speaking, and I'll start with a lighthearted example, which is we all know librarians are assumed book lovers and avid readers. And of course, I am both. However, despite what my bookshelf may suggest and my other bookshelves throughout my house, at this point in my life, I read ebooks pretty much exclusively. I need to be able to adjust the color scheme, the font, the text size, and I don't want to struggle with awkward, heavy print books. I also find handwriting notes, for instance, on a print book, painful and tiring. And it's difficult to keep all those print papers organized, right? So this was one personal reality that, again, pushed me into distance learning librarianship, but an impact of this assumption is that books given out during like book clubs or as a reward, tend to be print. But looking at it from a bigger picture, across all of education, There are assumptions about active reading, active note taking that are more serious and pervasive, right? So professors to this day still enforce ableist no laptop requirements in class and teach that digital reading is inherently inferior to print reading. More seriously, as a liaison librarian, there is an expectation that successful outreach and marketing of services leads to increased library sessions and consults, right? Which isn't always the case for a lot of different reasons. And it certainly isn't the case for distance learners in asynchronous courses where the goal is a successful module, digital learning object, etc., that in fact allows learners to help themselves without a meeting with the librarian. That said, during my second performance review, after my first on-the-job surgery, my lower library sessions and consultation numbers, which reflected 5 weeks of leave and 2 weeks with reduced hours, were responsible for my receiving a meets expectations versus exceeds expectations. And when I asked, because I'm still a relatively new librarian, is it the quality of my work or did I prioritize the wrong projects that resulted in my meeting expectations? Which was it? A supervisor at the time said quite simply that I had just missed too much work. I wasn't able to fully support my liaison area. And if I just did the same thing next year, without needing as much leave, I would get an exceeds expectations for sure. And that was certainly meant to be encouraging. But as someone who has had a total of 4 surgeries during my 6 years of employment, not needing leave is actually an impossible goal for me to achieve. And so that's a bit of institutionalized and internalized ableism showing up in my particular job role.
Thank you, Brittany. Thanks for tying that back into, the presentation around like systems and how they're built. And that's a great example of just like workplace expectations and levels of productivity that are just ridiculously ableist and yeah, all that's so normalized. So we're going to move on to another question. And Katie, you're up first to answer this question. Do you feel represented in the library field? Why or why not? How can the profession better support disabled librarians, especially those with intersecting marginalized identities?
So in some ways, yes, I'm a white lady, which is like 80% of the field, right? So, and my disabilities are not visibly apparent, so I can pass pretty easily as just any other librarian, even though I am pretty loud about disability. In terms of disability, I'm lucky to have a pretty strong community with other disabled librarians, which makes me feel more represented in the field. But if you're looking at kind of librarianship at large, it is at like every form of disability representation that I've seen come about in the last few years has really been like hard fought by disabled librarians, and putting in the work of calling things out, giving their time for free to make things better. We don't have any like structures for like dedicated to disability identity and library work. Like we don't have sections in ALA related to it, although we do for most other marginalized identities or independent organizations related to that, right? So we don't have a lot of focus on disability in the field outside of things like ADA compliance and like specific communities within specific disabled communities, and not really what it means to be disabled in librarianship. I think what the field needs to do to better support disabled librarians is having folks continue to attend things like this. sessions like this and having disability be really integrated into equity work, not just something that is talked about in terms of ADA compliance, but really what disability inclusion means. In libraries, when we talk about accessibility, it usually just means ADA compliance, which again, like we talked about earlier, it's the floor, right? That's what the bare minimum you're required to do by law. When we treat it as this like achievement that we became ADA compliant, that's not a good thing because you're federally required to do that anyway. We want to look beyond that to really talk about inclusion. And I think particularly what that means in terms of workplaces is providing adequate training to everyone on the accommodations process and really incorporating flexibility into your workplace cultures so people don't have to disclose a disability and request an accommodation. When you, like, if your library workplace always sends interview questions in advance to all candidates and has a policy that everyone can work hybrid, people won't have to request an accommodation then and disclose their disability if it's just part of the culture, and that saves them from a lot of potential discrimination. This is particularly true for BIPOC librarians who might not be able to hide their other marginalized identities, but if they're already facing discrimination in our field for something that they can't hide, they're less likely to be able to seek out those protected rights like accommodations because they don't want to put themselves at more risk, right? So it's really about kind of normalizing the accommodations process and just reducing the rigidity of our workplaces. Libraries saw that we could do that early in the pandemic. It's not an impossibility. And so we need to kind of incorporate that for everyone so that it puts less disabled people at risk and makes it easier for them to work.
Thank you, Katie. I can move on to the next question, but if anyone else wants to chime in on that, create some space for that too.
I just want to say one thing about like collection development. And so as a hard of hearing person, I don't find many books about my disability. So there are a few of them. So like there's a good kids book called Can Bears Ski? That's a fantastic book. Here and Beyond is another good one. And then the only one that I saw really in the mainstream was True Biz. The first like popular book that I saw actually go on, get checked out and have holds. And I think this is more of like a publishing thing to support us. But there are plenty of books for the deaf and hard of hearing community, which are actually different communities. Like I don't know ASL, but I still can't hear well. So like they're different, there's different, I guess, sub communities in the overall community. Like you talked earlier, Bree, about how there's different pockets of communities because it's not a monolith. And so I would say if you have any say in the collection development policy, whether ebooks or physical books, look into the disabilities and see what kind of options are out there.
Thank you, Brad. I love that suggestion. This is Brittany speaking. And I'll just add that I was my supervisor's first direct report to request official ADA accommodations. That was in 2021, aka 4 years ago. 2021. That's wild to me. So did we really not have any librarians who needed accommodations, or did we just not have a respectful and inclusive enough culture for disabled librarians to even try requesting accommodations? And I don't know because I was new. Regardless, in those 4 years, I do feel more represented in the library than I do in higher education. So for instance, I co-founded and co-chair my university's Disability, Neurodivergence, and Chronic Illness Faculty Staff Association. So I happen to know that my library colleagues are the most active members of that group, both at the librarian/faculty level and at the staff level. We also have an accessibility team with members from every department, and 4, soon to be 5 of those members have their IAAP Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies credentials, which is a long acronym. It's the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And so regardless of whether these individuals identify as disabled, neurodivergent, or chronically ill, they are absolutely members of the disability community and advocates. However, the same cannot be said of other colleges or support offices. Faculty participation in the affinity group significantly lags behind staff participation. And I know, based on direct communication with faculty, that they don't see any benefit to being associated with the group, let alone pursuing disability scholarship or service. So one colleague who's faculty and a member of that group recently published a piece on slow scholarship in which they discuss their experiences as a disabled academic. However, that brilliant 15-page piece did not contribute to their application for promotion and tenure because writing about lived experience doesn't qualify as scholarship in their college promotion and tenure requirements. Admittedly, none of that addresses the additional difficulties of getting, keeping, or moving up in a job that are faced by those with multiple non-dominant identities. So, as a white librarian with more economic stability than others, I take seriously the call to use my privilege to shine a light on those inequalities in librarianship and academia, including disclosing, presenting, and writing about my disability, despite, as Katie mentioned, having non-apparent disabilities. And I encourage other GLAM workers, especially those at the manager and administrative level who have similar privileges, to do the same, because, as others have said, when we can normalize sharing access needs and discussing barriers, we help all librarians thrive.
Thank you all so much. And I think we have time for maybe one more question that hopefully everyone can answer to send us off on this. And we will start again with you, Brittany. I know you just spoke, but what advice would you give to new or aspiring librarians and library workers with disabilities who are charting their course in this field? So any like initiatives, tools, or networks, which some of y'all have already spoken to this, but yeah, I mean, really just like, yeah, what kind of sentiments would you offer?
Thank you. This is Brittany speaking. I'll be shorter on this one because my first bit and most important bit of advice is to find your people. So when I did this, this is my first professional position. So the first job I got after graduating with my MLIS. So it's the only professional position I've had, right? So I say that with that limitation in mind. But I would say start in your library. If you're lucky, you were hired as part of a cohort, and those cohort members will be your first community, and you'll be able to connect on a variety of issues, from hobbies and onboarding woes to later on, as you know each other a little better, identity and professional goals. Then look on your campus, right? Look outside your library. My greatest strategy has been founding an affinity group. So join your affinity group, found one if there isn't one, start one. Those groups strengthen recruitment and retention of new employees. So it helps potential employees make more informed decisions, and it supports current employees, yourself included, by laying the groundwork for deeper policy change. And finally, look for people in this profession across the country, right? This is where ALA and divisions like RUSA or ACRL can maybe come into play. If depending on your role, like if it's a functional role, you may, practically speaking, be the only person in your library doing a job. So find people who can help troubleshoot positional challenges. And then we know that the number one reason folks leave a job is because of culture. So, especially as a employee with a non-dominant identity, you don't want to leave one place that's exclusionary to go to another place that is just as or maybe more so exclusionary. And so the people you meet across the country will be your contacts later on down the road when you're looking for a new job, because you can ask them honestly, what is it like to work at this library where you do work or you used to work, so that you can make the best decision for your current and future economic stability and growth.
I can jump in to kind of add to the conversation about community. Like I mentioned earlier, finding community on social media with other disabled library workers was really essential for me. And so I helped found a Discord that is dedicated to disabled library workers. It's called CryptLib. I can put the link in the chat, or you can email me to get access to it. But it's a closed Discord for library workers with disabilities. It's been really great. We have folks from all over the country and in Canada to kind of talk about both navigating the library profession, but also specific disability experiences. And the other thing that I would really recommend, especially if you're in the US, is ask that Job Accommodation Network. JAN is the free website from the federal government all about the accommodation process. So it has tons and tons and tons of resources, including for specific disabilities, specific accommodations. And if you're going through the accommodation process, I am a rep on my campus for my union, so I do a lot of work around accommodations. That JAN should be a really great first step in anyone's accommodation request, and it provides a lot of documentation you can take with you to an accommodations meeting. We also talk a lot about accommodations in CryptLib too, so we kind of help folks through those things there as well.
So I guess I'll make it 3 for 3. I say find your community as well. And so I'm also involved in the Hearing Loss Association of America's Boston chapter. And they usually have local chapters all over the country. And as a public librarian, one of the things we're constantly looking for is partnerships. How can we partner with different organizations in order to bring different awareness to our patrons? It also allows me to offer up the meeting rooms as a meeting space, where I recently got assisted listening system for the library, so that makes it an accessible venue. And so the chapter can hold meetings here. And so don't limit your community to just like your professional environment. Look outside, because there's so many support groups for all kinds of disabilities. And so get involved with that group or with that, whatever you feel comfortable with, because having someone who can empathize with your struggles, not just sympathize, is so important. It validates your feelings, and it can help you on those tough days in work. And I would be, as a technology librarian, I would be remiss if I did not say technology. There's an app for everything nowadays. And so I have the T-Coil headset that I mentioned, but my cell phone also has Bluetooth, so I can stream my phone calls and music and whatnot directly to my hearing aids. There are closed caption apps out there that you can get. And so there's so many different technologies out there that it's a tool. Yes, it's not going to solve everything, but it's a tool that may be able to help you on those tough days.
Thank you so much to all the panelists, Brittany, Katie, and Brad. Your answers were just I loved hearing this kind of like niche around library work and disability. And thank you for taking some of the concepts that I illustrated, which were a little bit more broad, and really bringing them into, accessible, tangible narratives for all of us. So thank you to you three, and thank you to everybody who is here for listening to my portion of the presentation. I'm going to throw it over to Hillary to close us out.
Hi, everyone. Yes, this is Hillary speaking again. Thank you so much for participating today. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists, for Bree for leading us through this great conversation, for Katie and Brad and Brittany for bringing their lived experience and perspective to this space. It's so important for us to continue advocating for disability justice and naming the corrosive impacts of ableism and attitudinal barriers. and finding community with each other. Also, a huge thanks to our service providers, our ASL providers, our CART provider, as well as my colleague Aubrey behind the scenes helping to support on the back end. And I just want to leave with this quote, the Judy Hoyman quote, which I love and I actually use as my email signature. Change never happens at the pace we think it should. It happens over years of people joining together, strategizing, sharing, and pulling all the levers they possibly can. Gradually, things start to happen. And then suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, something will tip. So just a reminder to stay connected in community. And thank you so much for being in with us today. And this concludes our program. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.